Welcome, everyone, to a very special afternoon here at St. Michael's College. Very honored to have two musical legends with us, Mike Gordon of Phish and the great Norbert Putnam here. And this will last about an hour. I thought we'd spend maybe the first 45 minutes or so with some questions, then open it up to everyone out here for questions the last 15 minutes or so. Yeah, let's get going. First of all, Mike, I have to know, what is it like to sell out Madison Square Garden?
Oh, it's
like 13 days in a row.
Yeah, they didn't all sell out though, so still pretty thrilling. But then to not repeat a song for the 13 nights is the hard part. No, I'm feeding back almost. That happens at Madison Square Garden too. Are we feeding back? Check.
How's
Testing 1, 2.
Yeah, I've got a hot signal, a lot of 5K going on.
Testing 1, 2. Could you make me sound more manly? I had a little bottom down there.
Yeah, and I'd like to be more effeminate.
Oh, that was a nice sound check, wasn't it? Okay. Now, what was the question?
Well, for you, Norbert, I believe, I think I can safely say you're the only person here today who not only saw the Beatles, but opened for the Beatles, I believe, back in their first American tour, yes?
That is true.
He's very modest here. So.
Well, no, what we did, the Beatles chose the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section. I was a kid who made those early records. We were 18 years old down there. We didn't know what we were doing. But the Beatles had a lot of our recordings. And years, I didn't really get to spend much time with them that night. As a matter of fact, I didn't spend any time with them. But in the mid-'70s, I'm producing a record for George Harrison.
Right.
And George was explaining all this to me. I said, how did you come to choose this obscure band from the little town of Muscle Shoals? Oh, he said, we made a list. He said, we had the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section, the Detroit Rhythm Section, Motown, and the Stax Rhythm Section, the American Rhythm Section. Yep. And he said, we weren't so sure we were going to make it, but we wanted to meet all of these great players. And I took that as, I thought it was very humorous,
okay.
You know. But yes, we backed up. I told George that we were doing a kid in Muscle Shoals named Tommy Rowe. And Tommy Rowe is a bubblegum singer, good-looking guy, big star all over Europe. And 2 or 3 years before, Tommy had gone over to play a concert in Hamburg. And a local promoter asked him if he minded having a local band open. They didn't have an opening act. And Tommy came back. We'd make a record with Tommy every year. And he came back, and he was raving about this local band with this bizarre name, Beatles, okay? And he's talking to our record producer, who was Felton Jarvis. He's saying, Felton, you have to sign this band because they've got something. And Felton said, well, what do they have? He said, I think you'd call it charisma. He said, they do twist and shout. They were just doing covers. They didn't do any original songs that night, you know. And he had a small tape. Tommy said, here's the tape, but it's the kid Paul in a hotel room with one mic, mono machine. It's Paul and his guitar, and on the chorus, 2 of the other guys. You know, that would have been John and George. They're going to sing the harmonies. All right. Well, the tape starts, and we're all looking at the clock because we've got an album to make, you know. And first thing we notice, the B string is flat on the guitar. That's one demerit. Can't tune his guitar. And then this kid, Paul, starts singing. And the lyric was the most trite, commonplace lyric and chord progression. It was one of those C, A minor, F, G things, you know. And something about wanting to hold the girl's hand. Well, anyway, we were not impressed. And the chorus came up. And the 2 backing vocals came in. And the 3 of them were so out of tune that Rick Hall, who was running the tape, just reached over and hit stop. And Felton looked up and he said, Tommy, I know it's too early in the morning for you to be smoking anything, but we've got a record to do, and let's get with it. And that was the end of the Beatles. Right? Next year they get a record contract. And Tommy comes back marches in with his chest out. I told you, he said. It seems the record was in the top 10 in England, and they were coming to America to do the Ed Sullivan Show. And they'd been talking to Tommy Roll. Tommy said, look, they're going to do the Sullivan Show on a Sunday night, and then take the train down to Washington on Tuesday, and they want to do one concert just to test the waters, and they want to know if you guys will be the backup band. And we were all saying, those guys got a record deal? You know, we couldn't imagine that they could have improved so much. And we're about to say no when the drummer, Jerry Kerrigan, who should have been an accountant, stood up and said, well, what are they paying? That was more money than we'd ever been paid in our lives. So we agreed to go do it, okay? And if you, I'm hawking my book. If you buy my book, the whole story's in there. But that's how we came to open for the Beatles. And years later, I worked with George, and I was at his house in England for about 3 weeks and got to know George quite well. And Paul and I would bump into each other in studios, and he was always the most generous guy in the world. I stole a lot of licks from Paul McCartney.
We all did.
Yeah.
So that you know, if you don't know, there's an incredible documentary about Muscle Shoals that we saw.
Yeah.
Very entertaining, and I recommend it for anyone.
Yeah.
Mike, I'll start with you, and same question to you, Norbert. What made you choose the bass early on?
I liked the vibration, and there was a specific moment for me where I was in the pool in the Bahamas standing next to my dad, and there was this calypso band playing, and they all had huge afros because it was the 70s for me. And I said, if I'm ever in a band, I want to do that thing. And my dad said he agreed. That there's just this vibration that gets into your body and not just your mind. From then on, and then it was the bar mitzvah circuit, always checking out the bass player. So, yeah.
That's wonderful. And Norbert, your dad actually played in square dances and that sort of thing, but he didn't teach you to play bass, though, right?
Well, no. I never intended to be a musician, okay? I had a piano lesson when I was about 12 from my Aunt Elizabeth, and she called my mother that night and said, don't send him back. He has poor manual dexterity, and his attention span is about 3 bars. And, and so that was the end of my musical career. But I'm 15 years old, and my dad has this acoustic bass because he would still play. He used to play on the radio down in Muscle Shoals, but he would occasionally play a square dance, which is like Irish, Scottish music. Well, some kids in my neighborhood, and I say that because we went to different schools. This one kid, Danny Cross, came up to me one day, and he was an underclassman. He was a year younger. He said, Norbert, I'm putting a band together to play this Sun music, Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins stuff, and you have to be the bass player. And I said, I don't know anything about playing the bass. He said, but you have one. No one else in school had one, okay? And I said, are you serious? Yes. And so I went to my father, and he said, I don't want you playing music. I tried that, and it didn't work out. I want you to come into the insurance business with me, right? My dad was going to be Putnam and Putnam's insurance agency. But he showed me how to tune the bass, and I started playing this simple Elvis stuff, I said to Danny, I said, what makes you think overnight I will become proficient enough to play in your band? And he said, well, this Elvis stuff only has 3 chords. Surely to God you can find 3 notes, he said. And so I found E, A, and B, and I marked it off with a pencil, okay? And I would come home from school every day and get out my Scotty and Bill records. Bill Black go boom, chicka-doom, chicka-doom. You play the note, slap the neck twice, play the note again. I had blisters all over my hands. But the thing that got me, we started to play some sock hops. That's what they call them at the high school. And the pretty young girls that had never really noticed us before started looking at us. It was no longer just the football players. It was some of these skinny musicians. And so I got excited about it. A year later, I got a Fender bass and switched from Elvis over to Ray Charles and James Brown. Okay. And 2 years after that, we started to make records in Muscle Shoals at the age of 18. And that's all the excuses I have. Okay.
And I'm curious, both of you there's common ground here in that you've worked with great bands, with Phish, with Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section, area code 615. What makes we're getting some feedback up here. I think what makes a good band click? Like, talk about camaraderie in a great band.
Oh, it takes hundreds and thousands of hours to cultivate that. From my experience, we've had 1,800 shows together in 34 years, and I'm still trying to figure it out and writing in my journals about it and talking to people about it. But I think it takes a certain kind of surrender to make a band click. And you might have a different experience since you're in a different world, but I think it takes a surrender where the music has to play itself to some level for it to be great, and you have to be willing to hear the people around you louder than you're hearing yourself even, and to lean on them rhythmically. I mean, as a bass player, we have to be powerful, and we have to have a surging, propelling force, but there's a balancing up between that and then just sort of hearing and adjusting and being sensitive and leaning on the drummer and the people around you, and there has to be that give and take or it just doesn't work. That's what I was thinking about a lot this summer. That was one of the things I was thinking about, and I actually tried turning my bass sound down, which is only a little bit down considering how big the bass rig is, and listening to the others more. Yeah, I mean, I would say that's the biggest thing. And if I ever am asked for advice for someone in a band where there's improvising, I say, try listening to the others even more than yourself, as one tactic.
And you've been together how many years?
34 years, yeah.
Did you get an award for that?
I don't think we did, but happy fans showing up still, so that's the award.
Years ago, I produced a record on the Memphis Horns, okay? And it had a bunch of great people sitting in. Robert Cray was hot at the time, and he plays guitar and sings a song. Steve Winwood came in, and John Hyatt. And I sent it up to Ahmed Erdogan, who ran Atlantic Records. Do you ever know Ahmed?
I didn't know him, but yeah.
Ahmed calls me up and goes, Norbert, I don't want the band. I said, okay, I guess I'm dead here. He goes, no, I want that single, John Hyatt and Ashley Cleveland. That's a hit. Give me that. I don't want the band. I said, why don't you want the band? Do you know what a band is? Well, I know this is a loaded question, right? So I said, no, Ahmed, what is a band? A band's a group of people about to break up. I gave the average white band $3 million. 2 weeks later, they break up. I lose my money.
Was that before or after Pick Up the Pieces came out?
Well, anyway, that's unbelievable because usually personalities will grate on you like in a marriage, I would think. You know?
Oh, yeah. But that was maybe our biggest trick is communicating and being all open and having the relationships stay good.
Well, my life was spent in recording studios, and I had in the last years that I played as a sideman, I think 1970 I did 625 record dates, and that meant I did 3 every day. I'd do a 10 to 1 with an artist, a 2 to 5 with another artist, a 6 to 9, and about a couple nights a week, 10 to 1 a.m., and occasionally Saturdays if we were really behind with something. And so I had a different drummer every 3 hours. I had a different keyboard guy. The guitars were all different. And the way it was worked out and explained to me, when I first went up to Nashville, I played with the real pros, okay? There was a drummer named Buddy Harmon up there. And I played a session for Owen Bradley, who produced all those great Patsy Cline, Brenda Lee records. And on the first playback, Buddy Harmon comes over and stands next to me, and he says, hey, kid. My name was Kid for a long time when I first went to Nashville because I was 20 years younger than the 18 Rhythm Section. He said, hey, kid, you're pushing me on the first chorus. Don't do that. I said, I'm pushing you? Yeah. No. He says, the way this works, kid, he says, now, I'm not responsible for the bass line or any of the chords or any of the melodies. My job is to anchor the rhythm section. And I'm going to lay it down, and you need to play precisely with me. And if you do that, we have this thing called a pocket. We move forward together at all times. So he says, we're going to do this again. You try to stay with me. Well, I didn't listen to anybody else again. Now, I'm playing acoustic bass, all right? And his drums are right there. I could reach over and hit the cymbal. We were that close. I'm playing acoustic bass. I'm watching his hands to make sure, okay? And so we play it all the way through. They're playing it back. He comes over and says, that's it, kid. That's all you need to know. and so my job was to try, in the early days in Nashville, we were in 2 or 3 track recording. If we needed strings or brass, they're over there. And if we needed a chorus, they're over there. We'd have sometimes 40, 50 people live in the studio, no headphones, okay? But the drummers could play so softly. My acoustic bass was sometimes the loudest instrument in the room. And without the phones, I could tune into different people, you know, as in a conversation where you got 7 people in it. And the headphones sort of took that away. The drummers started getting louder, and we had to isolate them. And I'm getting into stuff you care nothing about. I apologize.
Well, actually, if I could I want to interject a question, too, an amorphous question, because I've been thinking about this as it's so cool to be a session musician and get to play with so many people, and I admire that. I've wondered what that would be like, but at a certain point, you must have sort of realized that you've got a pocket that is desirable. And in bass and in music in general, does everyone know what pocket means? You know, when the beats fit together.
The bass and drums are doing this in complete.
And it doesn't always have to mean that you're hitting exactly together. Sometimes it's the best sound to be a little ahead or a tiny bit behind. Sometimes that's a good feeling sound. But how do you cultivate that? How did you become the guy that got the call from those people that has the pocket that they want?
Well, after I agreed to play with the drummers, okay, and there were some great ones, okay, and they really, the only time the drummer would ever play with me would be if I had say it was something like a vocal and the bass, so I'm going to carry the rhythm, then he would land with me. But other than that, you either come with me or we'll get you out of town. You'll be on the road with Winona for the rest of your life. You know? If a guy came in and couldn't lock in the pocket, you never see him again. Okay? And so my job, basically, 99% of the parts I played, I invented on the record. And I learned to play a lot of different styles. Being able to play the acoustic bass, I would work with Henry Mancini's orchestra, and Henry would write every note I play. And I have to bow the strings sometimes, and pizzicato. And I would do Al Hurt from New Orleans, and we'd have 4 bones and 4 trumpets and 40 pieces. But then I'd do Tony Joe White and J.J. Cale. And what I would do on Saturdays, I would study different forms of bass playing, just in case I get called. But the funny thing, the people who would book us were not usually musical people. Chet Atkins at RCA would have a list of 6 bass players. In the order he would like them to show up. And I think I was number 3 or 4 on his list. But if he called me, he expected me to play 7 or 8 different styles. And most of the studio guys could do this. We would listen to a demo of that first song with that voice and sort of morph into that kind of player, you know. And if you could do that, you could work all the time. So it had more to do with that than anything else.
A lot of adaptability.
Yeah.
Well, something that amazes me with both of you is this ability to learn songs on the fly. 237 songs, not one repeat this summer at Madison Square Garden.
We had a different donut flavor every night. We gave away 2,000 donuts each of the 13 nights, and we had musical themes to match. And we had 2 weeks of practice leading up to it. But Trey, our leader, guitar player, had new ideas every day. And so it was going to be a 3-hour show, and we also had 3 hours of practice every day to get ready for the new ideas. It's a lot of, and not to make everything perfect, just to make it passable.
Yeah, right. Well, I usually had 5 to 10 minutes to come up with a good bass part, or back to Muscle Shoals. Okay, and so it was a different thing. I'm usually, I don't know, I played so many styles that I could just sort of morph into it without thinking about it. A lot of times I would just place this finger on the first note, and the bass would just sort of play the right part. and I would sort of be the observer.
Yeah.
There's an old saying in music, that also applies to a lot of artistic endeavors. Your first idea is your best idea. Your first idea comes from your heart and soul. Your second idea is based on the judgment of your heart and soul idea. And that's when you say, I can do this better if I expand this. And your third idea, and you go down the line, and sometimes if you go back to your first idea, usually that is the best idea. A friend of mine, Larry Knechtel, played piano on a great Simon and Garfunkel song a long time ago, Bridge Over Troubled Waters. You remember that great gospel piano player?
Indeed.
And Paul Simon brought him into the studio, just the piano and Artie, the singer, Garfunkel. And he sat down with Larry and he said, I'm going to play this on my guitar. He wrote it on guitar. He said, but I want you to do sort of a gospel piano thing for me. And Larry was another one of these geniuses who could play a million styles. So Larry says, sure. And so he starts on this thing, and Artie goes in the control room. Roy Howley was the engineer. And he tells me the story years later, because he came down to Memphis and played the part for me on a Jimmy Griffin record. Larry said, okay, we start on Monday. It's Wednesday. We're on take 86. And he said, I walked in the control and said, Paul, I can't play it anymore. I just can't. I can't play it any better. I can't play it. I'm going home. And Paul said, well, I don't think we have it. And he said, I looked over, and there was a stack of 2-inch reels, like 50. They'd kept everything. And he said, would you just play the first one? And Roy Howley put the tape up. And that's the one you've heard. It was the only time we ever gave a Grammy to a sideman. And it was his first invention. So I don't know, just something all of you out there to remember as you sit down to try something for the first time.
And I have to ask, speaking of sessions, 120 plus sessions with Elvis alone, right? RCA Studio B. I mean, that's remarkable.
That's what the book says.
Yeah.
Now, that was over a 7-year period, okay. But my wife Cheryl and I, when we started to write this book, I wasn't so sure. I thought maybe I'd played on 50 or 60 Elvis tracks over the years. And then my good friend Ernst Jorgensen, he gets the key to the vaults at RCA, and also the union contracts that would name the players. And Cheryl came in one day and said, 120 or 122 sides you did? And I said, no. But
how do you avoid second-guessing yourself working behind someone like Elvis?
well, by the time I got to Elvis, I was retiring. It was 1970, and I've just produced my first record. And I decided to give up being a session player. Oh, my back was hurting from the acoustic bass. We didn't have cartage in those days. I had a station wagon with an acoustic bass, a bow, rosin to keep dry in the summer. It had to come into the air conditioning. A B-15 to tug in on wheels, and my 65 Fender Precision. And my back was hurting. My hands were, they were totally distorted. Huge chunks hanging off of these fingers, and I had a chance to produce a record. The record's a hit. Record producers get royalties for perpetuity. Okay, if I did a record in the morning with Tex de Jure, let's say, in Nashville, I got union scale. If I did the same thing that night for Elvis Presley, I made the same amount of money. And sure enough, if you worked enough sessions, you could make a lot of money. But I was looking to get out, and my friend Kris Kristofferson, a man I once mistook to be a homeless man, all right, in my book. Kris took a job at CBS Studios in the late 60s. And he was emptying ashtrays and sweeping floors. And he had no clothes. He had two pairs of black faded jeans and a bunch of black T-shirts and scuffy boots. And I knew he was making $35 a week. And with that Texas accent, belied the fact the man had been to Oxford. He's a Rhodes Scholar, okay? And one day, after about 3 months, he asked me one day, "Hey, Put, you think you could have a beer with me on your 5 to 6 break?" So I assumed he's going to ask me for money. So I took some cash, and so I take him to this restaurant. I said, "Order anything you want. I'm thinking he needs a good meal." I didn't know he would slip down to New Orleans once a month and fly jet helicopters out to the oil rigs. And of course, he never gave us any clue with his mode of dress. And so we're sitting there. He says, "Well, I'm actually up here trying to become a songwriter. And now I don't want to sit next to him anymore because everyone you meet would hand you a cassette." But I helped him do his early demos. And later on, he talks Joan Baez into letting me make a record. And I was lucky. I did an old Robbie Robertson song called "The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down," and it went platinum. I'm 28 years old, and now Clive Davis wants me to produce Dan Fogelberg. He says, "I want you to do all the folkies on Columbia." And I said, "I hate folk music." He said, "No, you don't." Clive, you just sold 1.5 million. Well, anyway, and that's how I went from being a record producer, a musician, to a record producer. The only person I played for in the 70s was Elvis Presley. And I would play bass on some of the Fogelberg records. Yeah. But Elvis was the best. Elvis is the most focused artist I ever worked with. The first week at RCA in June of 1970, I think it was, in 5 nights, working 6 hours a night, we did 35 completed tracks with vocals. We played it until Akeem got it. And if he got it on the first take, he would sing it until we got it. He was such a lovely guy. He'd say, "Elvis, could you do one more for us?" "Oh, yeah, sure, I can do that again." So he was a phenomenon. He was really a smart man.
And he learned by intuition. He didn't read music, right? So
No, he didn't know anything about reading music. Yeah. They would play him a demo of a song he'd never heard before. And if he liked it, he'd say, "Play it again." And they would hand him a lyric sheet. And I'll get this. They had a guy in California who did a really good imitation of Elvis's voice. And they would hire him to do the demos. And the band would try to do an imitation of an Elvis band. And so the guy who's singing it, and Elvis is going, it was Elvis imitating the guy who was imitating Elvis. Other than that, there wasn't a lot strange about it, okay? But he would sing it 2 or 3 times, and he'd look up at us. I have to tell you, I never learned any of these songs because we had a method for writing it out shorthand, and instead of using 7 letters, we'd use 1 through 7 numbers, okay? And let's say...
the Nashville system.
Yeah, and it's playing, and we're not sure what key it'll be in. So we write out numbers, and it's 1 6 minor, 2 minor, 5 7, 3 minor, 6 7, 2 minor, 5 7, And so we're just writing numbers, and then we would say, "What key do you want it in?" And they'd say E flat, and you write that up there and think the E flat scale, and it all works, you see. And as soon as that song was finished, in the wastebasket. I was in a bar about 20 years ago, and a guy came over and said, "Would you come up and play the bass part you did on this song?" I had no idea what I played on that song. And I didn't know the chord progression. So,
both of you are in rarefied company in the sense that your musical careers have fostered some of the most intense fandom in the world. I mean, with Phish fans, Elvis fans, parrot heads. I mean, the whole Jimmy Buffett phenomenon is its own cottage industry now. What do you make of that? I'm sure you never saw that coming, right? I mean, it was.
Music we all know it's an infectious thing, and I think we strive for the unknown and to reach these pinnacles of human experience, and people, we might not reach it, but people sense that striving, and they get on board, and the tricky thing, I've heard that if you pay attention too much, well, here's the tricky thing, is that you want to engage with an audience. That's what it's all about. And even if for a record, you want to imagine who's listening to it. And so it's got to be a full circle. But at the same time, as an artist, if you pay too much attention to the outside opinions, then you can desensitize yourself to your own inner gauge, and you can get caught up in it. Trey, from my band, doesn't read reviews at all, ever. And he believes, through his studying and talking with people, that positive criticism is more damaging than negative criticism, and then and he was reading a lot about people who get that Elvis sort of. There are books about people who get that godlike status, whether it's Jerry Garcia or Jimi Hendrix, et cetera, or even in sports or another. It can be really hard to deal with. It's great to have fans and people that are so happy that you can engage with, and people are so nice. I run into them in the street, and I get to be popular, and I wasn't popular in junior high, and all that is great. But I think you have to be careful, and I wonder if I'm not sure which is the 7 years you had with Elvis that you said that you were playing, but if you could see that phenomenon when as soon as you're considered to be a god of sorts, it's really hard to live up to.
Well, yeah, I want to say something about Presley. I took the call in 1970. I've retired as a bass player, but it was Felton Jarvis who had been a big part of my career. Felton said Elvis had been down to Memphis, and he'd had 2 or 3 giant records for the American Rhythm Section, Suspicious Minds and The Ghetto. And
Which we covered.
Yeah, and he didn't want to go back because Chips Moman wouldn't let him sing live. And every record he'd ever made in his whole career, he stood in front of the band and they played his emotion. And he wanted our band to play to his emotion. And so he's not going back. And he called Felton and said, find another rhythm section that can play like the American boys. And he said, well, I'll get some of the Muscle Shoals guys. And so we came in, and of course we were totally amazed at the way he handled us. I remember that before that first session, I was standing back in the bathroom, and I was thinking, this is the biggest artist in the history of the world so far, and gee, I hope my chops are up to this, I remember saying, dear Lord, don't let me be the first guy to screw up a Presley session, okay? And I went out there with some apprehension. He was late. He came late. He came 2 hours late to the session. But he walked through the door, and he was wearing a big black cape like King Ludwig of Austria or something, and he had a silver-crested lion's head walking cane with ruby eyes. And he took the cane and just pitched it in the air. And one of his guys caught it before it fell. They had rehearsed this. And took the cape off. And he did that. Another guy runs and gets it. And I thought, this is some super ego we're about to see.
Did you take off your bass and throw it in the air just to see if someone would?
I didn't know what to do. I'm thinking this guy's going to be the most unapproachable guy in the world, right? And then he did a funny thing. A couple of guys in the rhythm section he'd worked with before. And he held his arms up and goes, come over here. I got some of the craziest Elvis stories to tell you guys. And he parked himself on the floor at RCA Studio B. He's sitting on the floor. He's making himself small. And we all come and we gather around. And for 2 hours, he regaled us with the funniest fan stories. And he talked about Elvis in the third person. Okay? And he had us rolling and laughing. The session was to be 6 to 9, 10 to 1 a.m. And we were union players. We were there at 6 and 10. He would always come at 8. He would entertain us until 10 o'clock. We made one session with an hour overtime. Do I like Elvis Presley? Okay? And then at 10 o'clock, Felton would come out and say, Elvis, now look, we got to give RCA something. Let's get started. And between the hours of 10 and 4 a.m., which is not good for me because I'd have to get up the next morning, we would get 5, 6, 7 completed vocals. We didn't always get all the guitar parts because a lot of times James Burton, who was on the sessions, well, I would immediately play the first thing that came out of my head for the bass part, okay? And we'd get a good solid backing track, but Elvis's vocal would not be changed. And later on, James would overdub guitar parts or keyboard parts, but he was a great people person. By the time we started to record, I thought, well, hey, Tupelo, Mississippi is only 70, 80 miles from Florence, Alabama. He was just like all the kids I grew up with in high school. So all that stardom stuff had just fallen on the floor by the time we approached our instruments. So I was very impressed with this guy. And the other thing is, I play on 120 tracks, and never once came over and asked me to change a note. And I don't remember him ever saying anything to the drummer or the bass or the keyboard guy. He would be so centered on his vocal. I think he knew, if I nail this emotionally, we sell emotion in the end. If I nail this emotionally, the band's going to be okay. So that's the end of my Presley speech. When he died, it really affected me.
You were in Hawaii, I think. Right?
Yeah, it was like losing a brother because I watched him. In 1970, when I worked with him, he's in flawless physical condition. There's not an ounce of fat on that body. He's working out every day. He's doing karate, and he was good at it. He was 2 or 3 degrees. I don't know about black belts, but he was great at it. And then 3 years later, Priscilla leaves him. And I go over to Stax Studios in Memphis to record with him. And he picked up a little bit of a poncho, and he didn't seem to be as sharp. And 4 years later, he's dead. So it was a tragedy. There should have been an intervention, I think, and no one made the move. Intervention probably wasn't even a word in 1970s. Sorry to get morbid on you there.
Well, I have a question from one of my students who wants to know what's better, working live with a band out front or being behind the console? Being back in the studio, or
this is I only played live about 3 times in my whole career, and I was very uncomfortable because to me it's hard to hear live. In the studio I could hear everyone clearly. And I did 6 years ago. I agreed to go out and play the world tour for the Presley Big Screen Show, which was a 40-piece Vegas band. And Jerry Sheff, I don't know if you ever knew Jerry, was the player who played live with Elvis. And he was a master jazz musician. He played on Barney Kessel records. And Sheff started losing his hearing. And James Burton called me and said, would you come and play? Because at this point, my name is in all the record books for doing the original studio recordings. And I went out and we did the European tour. And I saw the fans for the first time. And it was the first time that I ever played a bass part and anyone applauded. They don't applaud in the studio. In the studio, I have to tell you, the musicians in Nashville would never congratulate each other for a great part. Okay? The older guy said, we get paid to play great parts. Why should I congratulate you? One day I did this killer bass part. I took over the record. I go in the control room, and the old guys are walking around looking at the ceiling, and none of them would look at me all the way through the playback. That was the supreme compliment.
Mike, what about you? Playing live versus working in the studio?
That's tricky because for me it's changed over the years, where as soon as I started having these peak experiences where music could be a flight in the air, I wanted that as much as possible. And I wanted to be touring, and I wanted to be, because my band's, a song will stretch out 20 minutes and we don't know where it's going to go. And that doesn't mean it's going to be good. But when it gets there, it's such a good feeling that I just wanted more and more of it. But there was always a feeling in the studio, people say this band is known for its live stuff, like the Grateful Dead. But there was a feeling in the studio of creativity that can't be achieved on the stage because of what you can do in the studio that I've always enjoyed, where you can overdub and you can underdub. You can go in there. We had this album we were making, which became Billy Breathes, but we didn't know what it was going to become, because we had a rule in 1995 when we went into the studio that we couldn't bring songs. We just were going to go into the studio, and there's 4 in the band, we were going to take turns adding something. We had a 45-minute 2-inch tape, and this was going to be the album. You could go to the 32nd minute point and add one note and hand it over to the next person, and we called it the Blob. And for 2 weeks we went in there. The first week we went in, we added to the Blob, and the second week we thought, okay, we'll take turns erasing. We've put it's getting a little dense, we'll erase. And after 2 weeks we said, why don't we get a producer and have some songs after all? And Steve Lillywhite came in and made a great album. But that's a kind of fun that, and not only that kind, because that was a little crazy, but there's a kind of fun that you can have in the studio that you can't have on stage.
But I bet it was really educational to all of you, too.
Oh, yeah.
You must have learned a tremendous amount of
Oh,
lessons.
yeah.
during that period.
I mean, I just finished an album. My album came out a month ago, my own album, Go-Go. And the producer I worked with recorded every single instrument and voice in a way I hadn't seen before, because he's known to be one of the most sonically innovative people. And it was some of the most fun I've ever had in my whole life. And I was at a studio where they had closets of vintage instruments and weird synthesizers, and every half an hour a new one was being brought out with this band that has a big appetite for experimentation. And I was calling home about it, and I was even telling it wasn't a Phish thing, but I was calling my Phish bandmates and telling them about it and journaling about it, because it was just so colorful of an experience. And at this point in my life, I'm having so much fun and appreciation for being home and working on writing a song and recording demos and being in the studio. And I still love that experience on stage where there's a room full of people and it gets to somewhere that was not predictable at all. But there's other kinds of moments in the studio. And I had a moment in the studio where I was singing a song. I was only on a few hours of sleep, which I think helps me. Doesn't feel good, but it helps. And there's a high falsetto-y part of the song, and every time I got to it, I started crying. And I didn't know why, but it was a catharsis coming through me, and there was some memory or group of memories that I don't know what they were, just being conjured up. And I'm in front of the microphone. I even asked my friend to film a little. I said, I know this is embarrassing, but do you mind filming this? And that's a different kind of peak experience, that in a way could only happen in the studio in that environment.
Yeah. What about the flip side? Can you think of the most difficult session you've ever had?
Well, that's an easy one for me. And it's in the book. Okay. I was late to come to reading and writing music, okay? When we start to cut hits in Muscle Shoals, I'm 18 years old, and my partner David Briggs and I decided that, Rick Hall, the producer, said, you guys need to learn to write string and horn parts so we don't have to bring someone from Memphis or Nashville. And so David and I ran out and grabbed a couple of books. I got Russ Garcia's book on orchestration. And also I was working on reading the bass lines, and I picked up Bob Haggart. Bob Haggart played bass for Perry Como's show in New York. And he had a wonderful acoustic bass book. And so I'm playing sessions over there, but I'm coming home and writing out horn parts and learning to do the transpositions, which is a handful, okay? But within a year, I guess, David and I were both writing horn and string parts, and we never ever had a teacher. I don't know if any of you know the Russ Garcia book, but as my career went on, I would bump into great orchestrators, and we'd talk about that, and they would say, that's the greatest book ever written on orchestration. Because you could literally read it and figure it out, But I get to Nashville, and my sight reading is much improved. Okay, I can read Henry Mancini's bass parts, and I've never had a session come to me with a part I could not play. But it was back there in the back of my head that one of these days, okay. And there was an arranger in town named Bill Justice. He spent time in Memphis, and Justice was a great arranger. He'd never call me. And one day I came home, my wife said, Bill Justice has you booked for next Tuesday at 2 o'clock at Columbia A Studios. Great, I said. And like a fool, I'm thinking, I prided myself at this point in being able to invent a great bass part quickly. I go down the next week, and I'd come a little early to grab the bass parts, and I would mark sometimes fingering if I couldn't instantly see it. I get there and there are no bass parts. And Jack Gold, the producer, said, look, he's running late. He's got a copy, he's downstairs. Everybody get in your chairs. And so at 2 o'clock, we're in our chairs. At 2:05, Justice comes through, and he's got all the copying over his arm. He starts with the strings, right? And he had his little voice kind of like a Jersey kind of person. And he's throwing it all around, And the last part to be handed out is my part. It's 4 pages long. And as I open it up, he's looking around. Okay, gang, 3, 4, boom. The whole band hits it, okay? I'm looking at the first bar. If I live to be 100 years old, I'll never play the first bar. And the second bar is just as complicated. and they played through the intro, and Justice waves the band off. And he looks over at me. That not the part? That not the part? That not the part, I'm thinking? At this point, I'm turning all shades of red because I know by the end of the day, the word on the street will be the kid from Muscle Shoals can't read well enough. And if that happened to you, you were never seen in the studios again. You hold up a session with 30 people on it, okay? So that's all in front of me. And he says, let's do it again, 3, 4. I just sat there. Okay. He walks over. You the kid from Muscle Shoals? I shake my head because I know it's over. Dad not depart? I said, Mr. Justice, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. Well, when I got the demo of this song, I called Beckham. I said, who played this outrageous bass part? I tried to take it down the way you played it. I said, I played this. He looked at, and he immediately looked into Jack Gold, Hollywood producer. Hey, Jack, could you play a little demo to the kid and remind him what he played? And he one of those things. And I, yes, I can do this, okay? And 15 minutes later, the artist has got his arm around me. I want you to play all my record dates from now on. So I went from being out of the scene totally to being back in the scene, okay? It was the only time in my life I was ever given a part that I couldn't instantly read. I took it home, though, okay? I took it home. And every now and then I'd get it out and play it and just look at it, you know. So that's my story. Thank God it never happened again.
Well, I'll tell you where my mind went, and this goes against your beautiful wisdom on first. There is an expression, first idea, best idea. So in that same session, once we had Steve Lillywhite and we were making the album, often it was the first take, was the good take, but not always. And there's a song, "Free," which became the single, and I like the way it turned out. Anyway, this is what the schedule was down at Bearsville Studios. We would start at 5 p.m. and we would go till 5 a.m. every day, and we would do one song for a couple days, 2-3 days like that, which is not as bad as Steely Dan, who apparently would work for 2 months on one drum part, with all the best drummers. Anyway, so we would do a few takes from 5 till maybe 7 p.m. and then have dinner and then do a few more takes and then do a few more takes and then do a few more takes. What was difficult about this session is that everyone else was on the exact opposite from normal schedule, and I was a little bit more normal. Like 2 a.m., I thought I could wind down and sleep right now, but what happened at 2 a.m. is that the band had a ritual of going to the Pinecrest, which is this pool bar in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. I think it's still there. And we met Evan Dando, who was recording one of his albums with Lemonheads, and we played pool and hung out, had a drink from 2 till 3:30 a.m., and then we came back. And at that point, I'm just lying on the couch, and I'm just thinking, can't this end? Because I think another thing that happens that's an interesting phenomenon and that I've read about is once you've given up, sometimes great things happen. And I had long since given up hours ago. And whatever I was going to play, Steve Lillywhite was standing there, and he was saying, "You have got to make it more sassy." And you've got to make it more sexy. What are you doing? And I'm like, what do you mean, what am I doing? I'm in REM sleep. It's 3:30 in the morning. I'm sleeping. It's like, well, that's the problem. So it's 3:30, and between 3:30 and 5 a.m. Now we're up to the 40th take of this song, which probably the first take probably was the best take. And it's the very last one that was like, okay, we've got this. So... But that's difficult. For me, it's difficult because it doesn't feel good to go past the point of giving up where you want to pull your hair out and you want to go to sleep and you want to do all those other things. You want to run away as fast as you can. But it is very interesting what happens from that experience.
Yeah. I think we have time for some questions from the audience. Anybody? Yes.
This summer, Phish played Isabella at Jimmy Buffett for the first time since 1998 or so, I believe. I was just wondering what it's like to play, to put a song away for that long and bust it out again.
Oh, well, there's so many songs that are in the repertoire sitting there, and so many not played and played 5 years ago or 10 years ago that it's all kind of a big blur. But that's a good song, and one difficult thing is, we get backstage and we practice it, and it gets really, I think it peaks out, and then we get on stage and something wasn't quite right. I can't remember what it was. I know that Trey was frustrated. But it's kind of like what I was saying before. There's something from the frustration that's actually really good that can happen in an aggressive song like that. But his daughter's name is Isabella, and it's a great song, and also a tribute and fun. And so you just gotta kind of roll with it. I think what I was feeling is I wish this were as good as it just was backstage, which is not. If you're thinking anything on stage, never mind something as bad as that, then for me it doesn't work. Any kind of thinking. I mean, there can be an observer observing, and I think that's good. And sometimes I'm thinking, what am I going to write in my journal about this? And I actually don't think that ruins being in the moment for me. But if you're second guessing it and thinking, well, this would be better if it were slower, or if it were a reggae groove, or if it were like it was backstage, or if it was like Jimi Hendrix when he did it, or if it was any thoughts like that, do not serve the situation.
Yes. Both of you here.
Could you go first?
That's a tough one. I'll try. That's kind of a hard question because every phase of a career is different and has its landmarks, and it's to reduce it to one thing is going to not be the full picture. It's going to minimalize it. But there was a moment that was a defining moment for me, which was in 1985, just down the road in Plainfield when we were playing at Goddard College, and I've talked a lot about it over the years, and that was kind of a life-changing experience playing with the band for two people in the dark, because that's how many people had come, and going out into the woods and deciding I want to do this every night because this was a peak experience, and then people over the years, fans and even in interviews, they say, are you able to have those kinds of experiences still after all these years? And I say, well, maybe. There's nothing like the first time, but I think it's a whole different bunch of parameters now. And you might not always notice what's so cool when you've done it so many times. And so I kind of look back at those pivotal moments sometimes.
Norbert, I think you wrote a whole book about great experiences.
It's really hard for me to choose a favorite. Cheryl, can you think of one? I'm asking my wife in the front row down here. Well, I'll speak just quickly about a few people who changed my life, okay? Growing up in Florence, Alabama, I heard about an older guy who had moved over to Memphis. His name was Sam Phillips. He grew up in Florence, and he goes to Memphis, and he starts Sun Records. And this truck driver comes in named Presley, and they have success. If that doesn't happen, I'm in the insurance business. Seriously. Those kids at my school would not have been putting a band together, you see. And so without Sam Phillips, also, none of us would have ever been good enough musicians to play on the First Hit Records without the early stuff we did with Sam, and his music. So Sam was a big deal. And then later on, after I became a successful player, Kristofferson and Baez, Kris was supposed to produce the record, and he talked her into having me do it. And that led me to becoming a record producer, which led me down through, I had a lot of success with Dan Fogelberg, millions of records. And 7 years into it, I met young Jimmy Buffett, and I took him down to Miami, and in the midst of doing all of these ocean songs, he wrote a song called Margaritaville. This is the 40th year of Margaritaville, and we've sold north of 30 million copies of that, okay? And So without those people, I'm just down there at Putnam and Putnam's insurance company, you know. So it takes a, you know, Morgan Freeman and I became friends about 10 years ago, and I love what he said. At last, after many years of Oscar performances and never winning, he did a movie called The $1 Million Kid or something. What was it, Cheryl? $1 Million Baby. And at last, they give him the Academy Award. And Morgan, who's a brilliant man, walked out on stage, and everyone thought he was joking. He looked at the audience, he spoke into the mic, he said, I want to thank everyone I've ever met. And if I think back through my career, maybe if you think back through yours, there were certain people, if they don't exist, I would never be in this position, you know. And that's what Morgan was trying to say.
Dave.
Going back towards the beginning of your career, you played with Dr. Alexander.
Yes.
Yeah, huge Dr. Alexander fan. I wonder if you could share some personal reminiscences of your time with Arthur, and maybe anything that might shed light on what made him so extraordinary.
Well, Arthur was seminal. Without Arthur, there would never have been a Muscle Shoals music scene and industry. We were kids down there. I think I said at 16 I got a Fender bass and moved over from rockabilly, Sam Phillips, and to James Brown land. And a young man named Dan Pennington was our lead singer, and he could do a great job on James Brown, Bobby Blue Bland, you know, with Two Steps from the Blues, and Stormy Monday was part of our repertoire. And then Ray Charles shows up with What Did I Say and Hit the Road Jack. And so that's our music. But about the same time, I met this delusional older guy down in Florence. His name was Tom Stafford, and Tom's in this book. And Tom, he was the manager of the Princess Theater, and he wore a blue blazer and gray trousers and a school tie, right? And he stopped David Briggs and I one night coming out of a movie. And this is a guy who could throw you out of the theater if you were cutting up, okay? And he pulls us over, and we're thinking, what did we do wrong? He said, you guys play in a band with Dan Penn, don't you? We do. Well, I'm starting a publishing company right here in River City. It was like a scene out of the Music Man. We're going to write hit songs. We're going to make hit records. And we were looking at this delusional older guy. He must have been 26 or 27. And so we went over to his office, and he said, I want you guys to make demos with these new songwriters. Well, Tom would sign anybody can make a rhyme. The songs were awful, but what were we doing? I was having to invent an original bass part to an original song. David Briggs was learning the keyboard parts. And we'd go there after school, and it was great fun. And about a year or two into it, maybe a year, Arthur Alexander comes up the steps. And he looks like a young Harry Belafonte. He's 6'2", gorgeous man. And he starts singing a cappella. Beautiful lyrics and beautiful songs with great hooks. He couldn't play an instrument. David Briggs would take him out to the piano, and Arthur would sing, and David would try different chords and harmonies. And it would take David about 20 minutes to get the chord progression, because he's playing Arthur. No, that one, back up. You know, and at last we'd have a chord progression. And so we did some demos with Arthur, and it was the best stuff we'd ever done. And a young entrepreneur from down in Russellville or Phil Campbell, Alabama, named Rick Hall came up the steps one day. He's an older guy, too. He's like 26 or 27. You couldn't trust those people, the older people. And he hears Arthur, and he says, I'm going to build a studio. He raised enough money to build a primitive studio. And I just started school at North Alabama University when we were called to this primitive brick warehouse studio. He only had mono. We had 2 mono tape machines. And the entire track would go down live with Arthur's vocal and all of our parts to one track. And it took us a day and a half to cut 3 songs. But without Arthur coming up those steps, without Sam, I never become a player. And without Tom Stafford, I never meet Arthur. And without Arthur, we don't get the entrepreneur, Rick Hall, who's the star of that film you saw, okay? It took everybody I ever met, you know. And Arthur, by the way, that was the only time I ever recorded with Arthur Alexander. We did 3 sides. Rick goes to Nashville, makes a very bad deal with a shady record producer guy who steals Arthur from him. And the record's, it's a hit record. Dot Records needs an album, has to be in stereo. Rick has 0 stereo gear. They did come down and put us all in the union to straighten it out with the union. But we lost Arthur, and I never worked with him again. But George Harrison told me the story of the day that John Lennon brought that first record into a Beatles rehearsal in Liverpool. Okay, and of course the Stones cover Arthur's songs, and so he was. I'm trying to get the city to put a beautiful statue of him in the local park there. We
They
have
don't have one
W.C.
yet?
Handy,
Wow.
but no Arthur.
You know, as an aside, Phish had an album produced by Barry Beckett. You probably worked with him. He was
Yeah, well when he came to Nashville, he left.
from Muscle Shoals,
The
keyboard
second
player.
Muscle Shoals section was Barry's section of David
Right.
Hill. And they came 7 years after.
Yep.
us.
Yep.
But Barry's a master.
Yeah.
He was the Sergeant Pepper of that group.
Yeah.
He taught the band.
I think we have time for
Oh,
maybe
we got
one
some-
more question.
Yeah.
Yes, you had your hand up first.
If you had any tricks or strategies, either as a producer or as a musician, for when you're in the studio and you had the mojo and then you kind of lose the mojo, if you're feeling stuck or something like, do you have those little go-to things you can do to get it back?
Well, yeah, I usually ask everyone if they like a glass of wine. And I go down the street, and it takes me 20 minutes to get back. And by the time I come, a lot of times the producer can ruin a session just with his presence, okay? Should I tell them about the Michael McDonald track I did? I'm doing Michael McDonald, who is a giant of American pop, right? And he called me, he said, I want to do a song on the Fogelberg record. And I said, great. I was hopeful he would do one of the 6 or 7 songs that people know Fogelberg. He chose one I'd never heard of. I said, Michael, I don't even know that song. He said, well, Dan was managed by Irving, and I was there to see Irving, and I heard Dan sing it through the door in his office, and immediately I had an arrangement for it. I said, well, you're Michael McDonald, you can do anything you want. I said, I've got a great band coming, because I was doing another track that night, and I mentioned the band. Oh, the band's great, he said. But get this keyboard guy, because I want him to arrange it. Well, a flag goes up. Michael McDonald's a great arranger. I said, well, why don't you arrange it? I love your keyboard. Norbert, I'm getting old now. I don't think I've got it anymore. Well, anyway, I hire the second keyboard guy, and I go down to the studio, and Michael's got him in the piano booth. And we did it at Quad, my old studio, just for nostalgia. And Michael is showing it to the guy. And I said, well, would anybody like some wine, okay? And I realized it could be a few minutes. And every hand in the room goes up. So I go down, I come back 15 minutes later, and I've got 2 big bottles of cheap wine, okay, red or white, and a bunch of Dixie cups. And Michael's on the piano. And I walk in, I said, I thought you wanted so-and-so. I don't know what's with, he's just not on tonight. And Michael's playing the most amazing piano part you ever heard, okay? I said, well, you want to try one, Michael? Yeah, let's do it. So the only thing I did that night was get the wine and ask Michael if he wanted to try one, and we got it on the 3rd take. Okay. So the number one job of a producer. Now, I'll say this: my whole life as a bass player, I was accompanying a singer, unless it was Al Hurd or Henry Mancini. Those were and I did some Chet Atkins records, but for the most part, my job was to morph into the kind of bass player for that voice. Okay. And it's much different from being in a band, you know. And but anyway, that's the producer's job is to make the artist as comfortable as possible, okay. And a lot of times I would lie. One day we came in for early overdubs, and this guy's voice was so bad. Obviously, he hadn't slept all night, and he's back there in the bass booth, and I just decided to try. So he does this awful rundown. Harry, wow, your voice sounds so manly today. Are you smoking again? You know, he goes, no, I'm not feeling it. I said, I love the way you're sounding today. Let's do it again. And he's thinking, maybe it's not as bad as I think it is, right? And I keep telling him how good he is. And about 20 minutes later, he gave me a great vocal. Okay? So a lot of psychology involved. You know, you must have faced that too.
Yeah, I'm just going to say the same thing to the question. If you step away from it and come back, same thing with songwriting. When you're stuck, if you go for a ride or a walk, or there's that whole book about that, the Jonah Lehrer book about imagination, which was defamed because of some wrongdoing in the writing of it. But it's still a fascinating book about all the examples of, well, one example is Thomas Edison, you know, who invented 500 different things and had a team of 50 people working for him. He took a 20-minute nap almost every hour, and that's where all the best ideas came.
I like that.
By stepping away from it. Yeah.
At my age, I
that's
like
the
that.
trick. That's the only trick I can think of, is you have to regroup and refocus. And if you've given up, there's also part of your brain that does a left-right brain thing in the process of giving up. That's helpful too. And I'll be working on a lyric and stuck for a long time, and then go to the bathroom, and that's always where the answer comes.
There's a great song that came out of Memphis, David Porter
Hold
and
on, I'm
Isaac
coming.
Hayes.
Yeah.
They were writing together for Sam and Dave album. I don't know if any of you remember Sam and Dave, a great duo. And David's late, and Isaac's working on this thing at the piano. And David comes in, he goes, "Get over here, I've got this thing happening." He goes, "No, I got to run in the bathroom." He said, "Well, hurry up." And he's yelling at it, and he's saying, "Hold on, I'm coming. Hold on, I'm coming." And Isaac goes, "Da-da-da-da-da-da-da."
That's great.
So that's a true story. You know?
A couple of things. We could go on all day. This has been amazing. Mike, let me just personally thank you on behalf of St. Michael's College for putting out that Haitian Relief record a few years ago. 1992, recorded here at St. Mike's. That was just a wonderfully generous thing to do. So thank you for that. And thank you both for your amazing talent. We're honored to have you here. Norbert, you're going to be signing copies of your book
Yeah, you should
afterward.
get this book. This book is a real deal. And all the money is going to the upkeep of our 2 standard poodles, right?
And Mike, I don't know if you have copies of Go-Go.
Oh, I don't have
You
copies
don't?
here.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So everybody, please, a round of applause. Very kind.